What if I told you that Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, was once ruled by kings who did not come from the Nile Delta, nor from Memphis, nor from Thebes, but from a kingdom far to the south in the land we now call Sudan, a kingdom known as Kush. The enigma of the Kushite Kingdom is one of history's most fascinating stories, because it asks a powerful question. How could a so-called lesser kingdom rise up and take control of mighty Egypt, the cradle of civilization? And what was their true impact on Egyptian history? To understand this mystery, we must travel back more than 3,000 years, to a time when Egypt was both vulnerable and divided. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt had already passed its golden age. Once the center of power and innovation, it was now fragmented. Regional rulers fought for control, the great temples lost their influence, and Egypt's borders were exposed to threats. Meanwhile, to the south along the Nile, the kingdom of Kush was growing stronger. The Kushites were not strangers to Egyptian culture. For centuries they had lived in close contact with Egypt, absorbing its religion, its art, its language, and even its political systems. Egyptian pharaohs once ruled over Nubia, the land of Kush. But over time, the Kushites gained independence. They learned from Egypt, admired it, and in many ways sought to emulate it. But unlike Egypt, Kush was rising, while Egypt was in decline. It was in this setting that a bold leader named Piye, also known as Piye, came to power in Kush. Around 747 BCE, Piye saw an opportunity. Egypt was fractured, its leaders weak. Marching north with his army, Piye launched a campaign that would change history. He conquered city after city, defeating Egyptian rulers who underestimated him. In an astonishing turn of events, this Kushite king took control of Egypt itself, establishing what historians now call the 25th dynasty, the Kushite dynasty. Imagine the shock in Egypt. For the first time in centuries, the throne of the pharaoh was held by a foreign king. Yet Piye did not see himself as a conqueror in the usual sense. Instead, he presented himself as a restorer. He claimed he had come not to destroy Egypt, but to bring it back to order, to revive its ancient traditions and values. In his famous Victory Stela, Piye described his conquest not in terms of violence, but in terms of divine will, as if the gods themselves had chosen him to save Egypt from chaos. The Kushite pharaohs that followed continued this vision. Kings such as Shabaka, Shabitku, and Taharqa embraced Egyptian culture with remarkable devotion. They built temples in the grand Egyptian style, honored the traditional gods, and restored monuments that had fallen into ruin. The Kushite rulers did not erase Egyptian identity, they reinforced it, breathing new life into a culture that had seemed on the verge of collapse. One of the most famous of these rulers was Taharqa. His reign, from 690 to 664 BCE, marked the high point of Kushite power. Under Taharqa, Egypt experienced a revival. He sponsored massive building projects, expanded temples, and even tried to extend Egypt's influence into the Near East. Biblical texts even mention Taharqa as a mighty ruler who opposed the Assyrian Empire. To his supporters, Taharqa was not a foreign king. He was a legitimate pharaoh chosen by the gods to protect Egypt's traditions. But the Kushite dynasty also faced powerful enemies. The Assyrian Empire, expanding rapidly in Mesopotamia, saw Egypt as a rival and honestly as a prize. The Assyrians launched devastating invasions, and despite Kushite resistance, they eventually forced Taharqa and his successors to retreat southward, back into Nubia. By 656 BCE, Egypt had fallen under Assyrian influence, and the Kushite rule over Egypt had come to an end. Yet this was not the end of the Kushite story. Though driven from Egypt, the kingdom of Kush remained strong in its homeland. For centuries afterward, the Kushites ruled from their capital at Napata and later Meroe. They developed their own distinct culture, blending Egyptian traditions with African influences. They built pyramids, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, leaving behind a unique legacy that, honestly, still stands today in the deserts of Sudan. So what then was the true impact of the Kushites on Egypt? Some historians argue that they gave Egypt a final burst of glory, a renaissance of ancient traditions that might have otherwise disappeared much sooner. Others suggest that their reign was brief and ultimately overshadowed by the rise of Assyria and later powers. But what is undeniable is that the Kushites proved something extraordinary, that Egypt's greatness could be preserved, even by those once considered outsiders. The Kushite pharaohs remind us that history is not a simple story of one civilization rising and another falling. Instead, it is a story of exchange, adaptation, and renewal. The Kushites may have come from beyond Egypt's borders, but in their devotion to Egyptian culture, they kept its spirit alive. They showed that the Nile's power did not belong to Egypt alone, it was shared by all who lived along its waters. Today, the pyramids of Meroe, the temples of Napata, and the monuments restored under Kushite rule still stand as silent witnesses to this forgotten dynasty. They are reminders of a time when Africa's hidden kingdom rose up, conquered Egypt, and left an impact that echoes through the ages. So, the enigma remains. Was the Kushite dynasty a chapter of revival, a final golden age for Egypt before foreign powers took over? Or was it the story of a people who stepped out of Egypt's shadow and claimed their place in history? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. One thing is certain, without the Kushites, the story of Egypt, and perhaps the story of civilization itself, would be incomplete.